Well, it's after 3:30. I think we will go ahead and get started. My name's Yanniken Smucker. I'm a co-editor of the Oral History Review. I'm really pleased to see you all here. I so wish we were in person, but I'm really happy that we can all be in the Zoom room together. I'm very pleased to moderate this session with colleagues that I worked with. So we pulled together a special section on COVID-19 and oral history for our most recent edition of the Oral History Review. I'm going to pull up a screen share just for a moment, and I'll also share this link in the chat so you can take a look on your own time at the table of contents for this special section of the journal. Am I sharing? I am sharing. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Thank you. Probably sharing more than I want to be sharing. Here's the table of contents for the special section. I'm also going to throw this in the chat, and you can take a look at it there. Routledge, our new, generously made all of these articles free of their paywall, so you should just be able to click and read without needing to log in with your. I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists. Everyone's going to give a little brief introduction about their contribution to this special section. We'll start with my colleague Abby Perkness from Kean University, who is a co-editor of the Oral History Review. And then we'll turn to Anna Kaplan, whose article, Cultivating Support While Venturing into Interviewing During COVID-19 was part of the special section. She's an independent oral historian. Then we have Stephen Sloan from Baylor University. His article, Behind the Curve, COVID-19 Infodemic and Oral History was sort of the lead essay in the section. And then we have Jason Kelly, who is the director of the Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis Arts and Humanities Institute. And he will be sharing from his article on the COVID-19 oral history projects and preliminary notes from the field. And keep in mind, so all of these articles we solicited back in April and were written during April and May. So in terms of COVID-19, that's kind of ancient history now, but we'll touch on that, how things have changed over these last few months as well. But I think it's a really important contribution to the field of oral history to think about in real time how this pandemic has affected our practice and how we as practitioners of oral history can affect the pandemic as well, and certainly how we document and record it. Rather than hearing more from me at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Abby, who will tell us a little bit about the background for the special section.
Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us today. I am also going to speak just briefly because I think what you're probably most interested to hear about is the work of the authors in the section. But I do want to tell you a little bit about how we got here. In preparing for this session, I went back through my email. I was trying to nail down kind of exactly what led us to think about this and when we started talking about it. And literally my email goes from like March 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. We're dealing with the production of our spring issue. Everything's business as usual. We're emailing with our copy editor. We have our last proof come in. And then 3 days later, we have a rough draft of our special section or of an editor's introduction. As it was for, I think, everybody in this room, right? The week before, I was on phone calls about the Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic Conference, trying to decide if we were going to hold it as things were starting to get messy. And then the next day, my kids' schools was shut down, and my husband was working from home, and I was working from home, and we were all dealing with these significant global disruptions. And this was true for all of us at the Journal. we all have young kids, we all have jobs outside of the journal, and we were all kind of grappling with, what is this going to mean for our ability to work on this? And what is it going to mean for authors, right? Are people going to have the bandwidth to produce scholarship and articles during this time? Are people going to be able to review pieces? How are we going to think about moving pieces through the development stages when we have no idea what the world is going to look like in 2 days, let alone 2 months or further out? And that kind of having that conversation, that just kind of like debrief, led us to think about what this would mean for the field. You know, all of us had that initial impulse, right? We need to document this story. We need to tell this story. Yannick and I were both working with our kids on like how to tell this story among their friends. This was just, you know, as oral historians, this is something that I think we're all kind of ingrained either by birthright or by education, that this is what we do. But this was such an unprecedented moment for us and for our field that we really needed to stop and think through. I'm just going to mute this person real quick. What that would look like. And we started to think about how we could deal with this as a journal, right? So at first we have this wonderfully prolific blog that Yannick manages. And we thought, well, we'll do it on the blog. That's a really kind of responsive, nimble way to do it. And then we thought, well, we have this platform, right? We have this journal, and we as editors have the ability to kind of shift around some of the things we had planned and really try to tackle this in quote unquote real time. So we got permission from our publisher, and we set to work. And we started by thinking about what topics we wanted to cover, and those ranged from, you know, the ethics of interviewing now, how we would deal with remote interviewing, what this meant both to interview about COVID, but also not about COVID, how we would deal with HIPAA and with medical questions in oral history, whether or not we should be interviewing at all. So all of these kind of baseline questions. And then we started to think about who might be good authors for this, right? People who had been speaking out publicly in the field. There was, you know, significant conversation taking place on various platforms, or people who had written previously about oral history and trauma or oral history and crisis. We sent out our call on April 2nd to our authors, and we asked them to produce a piece by May 1st. This is, I mean, as we wrote in our editor's introduction, this was a Herculean task even in the best of times. And we had absolutely no business asking these authors to put their lives and work aside in this month of extreme disruption and to start thinking about what they were doing. But they all said yes. They all said, you know, this is stuff we're thinking about anyway. Thank you, or like, I hate you, but we will take you up on your offer to think about this in a more public space. All the articles came in right around May 1st. We went through a relatively rigorous peer review process in the same way we do for our regular journal processes. And then we did developmental editing with each of the pieces. One of the pieces that we solicited and one that went through some of these developmental editing stages, the authors decided to pull it. Ironically, it was a piece about slowing down, right, and putting down the mic. And the authors, I think, decided they just needed more time to process this and to think through what they were putting out into the world. And so that is a voice that is missing in this section and one that we wish were there. You can read the editor's introduction for a little bit more of that process. I don't want to speak too much more, but I think one of the things we say in there, and I just want to highlight here, is that this is the beginning of a conversation, right? We don't see this as a culmination. We know that there are voices missing in addition to that slow down impulse. This is a very US-centric issue. There are no international pieces because we just weren't in a space to kind of think globally in that moment, but we hope to kind of bring in those voices through the blog. Or, you know, I haven't spoken to Yannick or Dave, but I can kind of envision another special section, you know, 3 or 5 years from now, reflecting back, hopefully, on the pandemic and thinking about how it changed our field. I suspect that will be for the next editorial team to tackle. So I'll turn it over to Anna, who will talk about her piece specifically.
Thank you. I'm Anna Kaplan. I'm an independent oral historian and historian, and I work in Washington, D.C. And at the time that the pandemic started really affecting the US, the East Coast, and DC, I was working with the DC Oral History Collaborative, helping to support grantees who were doing oral histories. And so when the pandemic started, it was a question of how do we teach oral history at this time? What are the best practices of oral history? How do we support these projects and send people who are very new to oral history out into the world to do their first interviews at a time when even seasoned oral historians are starting to do oral history in ways that they never have before. And so part of what I was looking towards was sort of looking inward at this network of oral historians that we have and reconnecting with a lot of colleagues about how we do oral history, how we go about helping others do oral history at this time. And thankfully, I was approached to write this piece. And for my essay, I was looking at some of the conversations that people were having and that my colleague Maggie Lemire and I were having about supporting the grantee projects through the Oral History Collaborative. And so this piece sort of helped me work through some of those ideas and conversations and really sort of bring to light a lot of these conversations that the field or people in the field have been having about how we do oral history, how we make oral history more accessible, more inclusive, and that the pandemic really sort of shone a light on some of these issues that people had started talking about or had been talking about for a long time, but suddenly became sort of more central issues to more oral historians. And a lot of these centered around support for oral historians, both working with institutions, but also those who are freelancers, of support for narrators during this time, of building different levels of support into project designs, including how we approach narrators, when we approach narrators, how do we create more longitudinal studies or projects, projects that incorporate communities and their positions, their ideas, their thoughts. And then also, how do we use oral history in this moment, not just to collect, but to help connect to other people, to help people connect to each other in this time when there's a lot of social distancing and a lot of disconnect? And how do we use oral history to really bring people together, whether we are collecting for an archive or just doing oral history as a way to connect people and to share stories, and to bring some more humanity into this time when it feels like people are being isolated and siloed and not listened to. So those were a lot of the themes that came up in my piece and that I wanted to share with this conversation that I was a part of. And I really want to thank Benji de la Piedra and Crystal Beck for reading some early drafts of my essay and giving me feedback. And then, all of the oral historians who welcomed me into conversations that really started at that point, but then have continued to evolve. And I think also, we'll probably talk about this more, but as Abby mentioned, one of the things that I found interesting myself as a scholar was writing that first draft, having it sent out, and then maybe a month later, not even a month later, getting the draft back and reading it again and realizing that my perspective on oral history in the pandemic had changed even within that first month. And that the draft that I had originally written felt very foreign and not familiar and not pertinent to the moment that we were in a month later. And that's something that I think oral history will continue to experience as we continue through the pandemic, as it, goes a year, even beyond. And so it'll be interesting to see how this conversation continues, how it changes the field, and then also sort of what we incorporate from these new practices into oral history going forward, even after the pandemic is over.
Thank you, Anna. Next, we'll turn to Stephen Sloan.
Thank you. I'll talk just a little bit about kind of the thinking behind my piece and why I think I was included on this. It was a quick yes, just because I would have hated to have not participated in this effort to get the opportunity to reflect on what we were all thinking about at the time. I really see this as part of a kind of a long change in oral history over the last 20 years ago, as oral historians have kind of embraced the more recent past in doing work. I think going back to the 9/11 project, I experienced this myself in 2005, going to the Providence meeting in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and talking to oral historians about initiating oral history projects on Katrina. I realized I didn't introduce myself. I was supposed to introduce myself. So back up. So I'm Stephen Sloan. I'm the director of the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University. I'm an Aquarius. I like long walks on the beach and writing journal articles in 4 weeks. So back to the story. So in 2005, I went to the meeting in Providence and really I remember a plenary there, a lot of pushback over the idea of kind of working in the immediate wake of events, and just the idea that this is not the place for oral historians to work, which, I think we're all feeling that impulse now. How could we not work? The conversation now is, how do we work in an ethical way? I think for the most part, how do we work in an ethical way? And we have a desire to engage here. I think that change and that long shift in oral history has been exciting, because I think it's made us engage in meaningful ways with some other disciplines that work in those sort of settings. So from intentionally interfacing with psychologists to people that work, to journalists, to people that work in kind of disaster response, healthcare. There's a lot of different fields in which I think oral historians are engaging more intentionally over the last 20 years. And so I think we'll see this. And of course, Abby promises at some point we're going to be able to reflect on this. I'm looking forward to reflecting on this, but I think we're going to see in this a long change that's occurred with oral history. And I think it's exciting because I think it's added new vibrancy to oral history. It's connected us to new people. Oral history has never been siloed as some other approaches or methodologies, but I think it's allowed us to maybe kind of refresh ourselves by engaging with some other areas. And so as I thought about what I might want to write for this, we immediately started getting inquiries about distance oral history interviewing. And so we knew something was up with oral historians. A lot of folks are interested in doing work, and principally doing work on COVID. We organized a online workshop on distance recording, a really early one on March 31st. I remember we regularly offer online workshops. At 15 minutes till it started, there were 300 people in the room. And so we had over 500 participants from all around the globe that were interested in this. And there were several. Doug did one, who's in the room, and Columbia's done one, Berkeley's done one on distance recording, which have been great. It's been great to see those that have some knowledge here rally and provide the oral history community some training on how to do this. But from then immediately, I knew there were a lot of people interested in doing this sort of work. As I personally started to think about why oral history was important at a time like this, one of the things there's two things that I think are central to our practice that are really important. And one of those is we push back against stereotypes and generalizations. So as oral historians, I see what we do is really important in that. We frustrate narratives by introducing counter narratives, and we frustrate the understanding of X by saying, yes, it's X, but it's also Y and Z and all these things that you haven't thought about. And what I noticed early on with the coronavirus, and this connects to a concern I have with quantitative understanding of events, is it leaves out the exception and it leaves out counter narratives. And so the title of my piece, which is Behind the Curve, just is connected to that period of time. There was a real obsession with flattening the curve. And one day, as I was thinking about it and reflecting on, well, the curve is lives. I mean, we're there are personal experiences behind this quantitative data that are really kind of being lost as we focus on the quantitative aspects of this. And oral historians have the tools to be engaged here to make sure the human experience, whatever the varied human experience of this is going to be, can be documented and understood. I also noticed between the first draft and the second draft, and Anna, my first draft and second draft changed dramatically as well. I was really amazed at the number of story gathering efforts that were going on globally. It was impressive, the range of story gathering efforts. But what I noted about those story gathering efforts is most of them were very passive story gathering efforts, and they may not like me giving them that name. But what I mean by that is they were collecting stories, but there wasn't an active intervention by an oral historian to help curate or collect or investigate those stories. It was more, there were more online databases that were collecting stories, sending in using digital platforms. And we've seen some of this in the past, but mass observation and other instances that we've seen of that. But I was amazed how many there were and how few of them were engaging oral historians in the work. And so that aspect of oral history I thought was really important for us to be engaged in gathering kind of the broad range of human experience of this. And I think it takes the intervention of an oral historian to do it as best as it can be done. I have a high value in what we do. Maybe I'm biased, but I think our engagement really creates a data set that is much more interesting than what would be passively gathered. The other aspect of our practice that I thought was really important here is connectivity. I see oral history as a tool of connectivity, both in connecting people to their own stories and connecting individual stories to some broader narratives. Understanding the particular, I think, is the way to understand more universal understanding of events, and then understanding universal events helps us kind of know how to approach understanding of the particular. So that connectivity piece seemed even more important as the social fabric was being ripped apart a bit, and we were dealing with being connective in our own lives and kind of dealing with this liminal space that the pandemic presented, that we're all weary and fatigued of right now. I thought oral history as a human interaction was extremely important in times like this, and it took on a level of meaning that I don't think it necessarily had outside a sort of pandemic environment. And so those were the things that I thought of as I moved into my piece. And I would say we're going to get an opportunity to talk about how our thinking's evolved. But I think it is reflective here of what it is to do work mid-crisis. We just don't have a lot of data mid-crisis. We have a lot of people reflecting on events and drawing out lessons learned, but we don't have a lot of data on the experience mid-crisis. And all our COVID stories have evolved and shifted and changed. And I think this oral history data is going to be extremely interesting to know month by month, week by week, what the varied experience of this was, that human experience of it. And so I was happy to contribute.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And up next, we have Jason Kelly, who we asked to contribute to this section because he and his institution launched a project, a working project very early on. And we really wanted to make sure that we had the perspective of someone working immediately amid crisis. Jason?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. Before I get started, though, I want to thank the editors who worked with us as we moved moved our essays through the publishing process. Of course, as they've already mentioned, it's difficult for an author to turn around something like this in a month, but on the editorial side, that's a huge amount of work as well. So I just want to thank them for all the work and guidance that they gave us. My experience, the reason I was asked to do this is because the research institute that I direct, the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, began this project that we called the COVID-19 Oral History Project within about a week after it was clear that our university was not coming back after spring break. At that point, it was kind of early to mid-March, as all of us were concerned about issues of COVID-19 and the broader effects. I was in the middle of teaching a course called Digital Public History. It's a graduate course. And so I have all these graduate students in public history. They're in training. We're halfway through the semester. We're about to enter a next phase of our project, which is this deep analysis of Frankenstein through digital mapping and social network analysis. And I went to the students and I said, well, in a typical semester, I'll teach the oral history module, but I had cut that out so you could get social network analysis this semester. Would you like me to reintroduce the oral history module? We'll just throw out the rest of the semester and we can participate as public historians and do oral history kind of live. And unanimously they said, yes, let's throw out the rest of the semester. We're going to move forward with this oral history project. And it's really that engagement with students that is the origins of the work that we're doing in Indianapolis. We were doing other oral history projects at the time. We were actually in the middle of an environmental justice oral history project at the time, but because that was reliant so much on us being on the ground with individuals, we were able to turn our attention pretty quickly to a new mode for us of oral history collection through a digital kind of the Zoom interface. Also in those early weeks, what we did was we teamed up with the folks at ASU, Arizona State University, at the Journal of the Plague Year. What they had been doing over the course of those first few weeks and months was pulling together a group of scholars and museum specialists and teachers from all across the country who were collecting with their students in the classroom, collecting through their institutions, kind of the digital world, the digital ephemera of COVID-19 and archiving that. And in fact, that project now has 10,000 objects, over 10,000 objects. But what they didn't have at the time was any strong oral history components. So within those first few weeks, we decided to team up together. And what we decided to do was have our project kind of become the curators for this larger project, the Journal of the Plague Year project, and take all of the oral history work that we were doing and kind of putting it into their archive. It was a really great collaboration because what that did was meant that we were able to network with scholars from across the country who were doing oral history work and actually able to tie our work in Indianapolis with their work as well. And that brings me to the first thing that I learned from doing this project, which is the value of that kind of national and at times international collaborative experience in oral history work that I think being forced into the digital world kind of forced those connections in certain ways. And so what we were able to do then was think both kind of locally at the work we were doing, but also start making connections with folks in other cities. And so we were able to team up immediately with some great projects that were happening at the University of Cincinnati, at Northeastern, at Wisconsin. So we were all able to start talking and meeting weekly across the country and thinking about some of those big ethical issues that we've already talked about a little bit in these presentations, as well as the technological issues that are not only are related to process of collecting and collecting oral histories, but also archiving those oral histories as well. And there is a lot of complications that emerge and continue to emerge in a project that is both driven by the work of oral history researchers, folks who are trained in oral history, but also folks who are training individuals in oral histories, students. But also projects that are in some ways kind of citizen archive, people who are citizen archivists, kind of this crowdsourcing approach of collecting oral histories. So trying to merge those different approaches to collecting and then interpreting in the archival context. I don't want to talk too much longer because I know we have a lot of time to chat about some important issues that have come up. I've already mentioned the importance of collaboration across national and international networks that became very apparent in the work that we were doing. But also what was important, I think, and it's because it emerged out of the classroom context, are the possibilities of this format for training students, getting them engaged. And what I heard back from my students is the power of this experience for them. I heard ideas from them such that this participation in this oral history project at this moment of crisis was the thing that grounded them and got them through the semester. It's the thing that connected them to other individuals who were working both on their campus and further beyond. So it was actually very important and continues to be very important to students, this participation in this project, even as this crisis unfolds. So in the end, I think this has been a really important opportunity to think about our methods, but also thinking about the opportunities eventually as we move out of this moment of crisis and think about what we've learned that might actually transform and improve or expand perhaps the way we think about and practice oral history.
Thank you, Jason. Since we've all touched on sort of how fast this is moving and how much things have changed dramatically over, well, both dramatically and sort of incrementally over these last few months, I think before we really dive into a lot of the implications for the field, I think it's useful to reflect, as Stephen said, on what's different now. So you wrote these articles so early on. I mean, Jason's project was in its infancy, really. We were using that phrase behind the curve or flatten the curve all the time. Now that's sort of out of our lingo. We're talking about the rough fall and winter that we have ahead of us. We're dealing with different issues, and we also know that we can't just pause everything because this is life as we know it for now. So I'd love to hear from our panelists. What has changed since you wrote this article? How would you perhaps write a new article now if we were cruelly going to ask you to do this again? Any one of you can jump in.
Well, I'll start just because it's always hardest to start. I don't know. That would be my answer. But the long pandemic, I continue to kind of notice little things that suggest, what I flew 2 weeks ago to Colorado, which felt very normal to be able to fly. But I was in the TSA line, and it was a long TSA line, and there was a baby there. And I was, doing what you do when you see a baby. I was interacting with the baby, and I was making faces at the baby. And then I realized the baby only saw from here to here on me. And so I don't know what toll it takes on a baby for the first formative years of their life to interact with strangers, only seeing this much of their face. But it began to make me think what the long effects are of this pandemic, and the way in which I think every community we're engaged with is going to have long-term effects here. I was interested in doing research on the Spanish influenza and just what it did to social trust, and social trust in many ways never recovered after the Spanish influenza. And so I think, for me, it would be probably teasing out some of the effects that we're already seeing of the long pandemic as we see it here, because I think there are some very subtle but pretty profound changes. Just because it's gone on for so long, they're going to have profound effects in a lot of different areas.
Go ahead, Anna.
So I was going to say, sort of similar to that, is that one of the things that I noticed most that my piece changed from the first draft to the second draft, and that I think would change again writing it now, is that idea at the beginning that it was only temporary, that it was an immediate change, but it was very temporary. And then by the time the second draft came, it was like, okay, this isn't temporary, but it's still kind of temporary. It's a longer temporary. And I think now one of the things that would change in writing it again would be really thinking about the way that it has already fundamentally changed our lives, not only our practices as oral historians, but our lives in ways that we have adapted to the pandemic, and maybe consciously, but maybe also unconsciously, sort of absorbed it into our everyday lives, and really sort of think through the implications of that in terms of how we tell stories, how we interact with each other, whether or not we still feel that same sense of urgency of collecting these stories, sort of how that changes the way that we do oral history projects at this moment. And then also along with that of, one of the things that I was very much attuned to at the beginning was the loss of funding for oral history, and sort of the financial impacts on oral historians who may not have positions at institutions, or may not have like firm affiliations with continued employment. And I think that is still true, but I think it takes on a different, sort of a different scope. Whereas at the beginning, it was sort of an immediate cut of employment opportunities. And now I think it's sort of more of a long-term financial impact that we're facing in terms of, what is the long-term disappearance of these jobs, not just for a couple months, but for years. And sort of as a field, how do we grapple with that? How do we support all oral historians, specifically those who are losing long-term employment?
One of the things that became pretty apparent, and it's in the article that I wrote, was that even though a lot of us as faculty members who are working with students collecting the oral histories were emphasizing the importance of collecting diverse voices in the work that we were doing, we were talking regularly about silences in the archive that we were creating, and the power structures of archives. When it came down to it and we received that first batch of oral histories, that first maybe 150 oral histories that came in, what we received back from students who were doing the work on the ground was not actually a very diverse set of interviews. So there was a disconnect somewhere between what we were talking about in the classroom about diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic racism, etc., and how that got implemented in practice. So with the work we were doing with our students. And we spent some of the summer talking about this in our regular meetings. And one of the things that I think we've landed on, or at least several of us have landed on, was that it was our approach. Our approach was too generalized. Our approach was, we asked the question, what is the experience of COVID-19? As opposed to asking more direct research questions about, for example, what is the experience of COVID-19 at the moment of Black Lives Matter? That's a much more specific question to ask. And that is in fact the question we're asking this year. So in September, at least 2 of the universities involved in the COVID-19 Oral History Project are actually specifically focused on that intersection of Black Lives Matter, protest movements, and COVID-19. And all of the oral histories are related to that intersection. And it's actually changed the type of history or the voices that are included in the archive just by that very slight change in the research question itself. So this is maybe from the pedagogical side of what we were doing, which is, if I could go back and talk to Jason back in March, just give Jason that small little bit of advice and remind the Jason of March 2020 to give that little bit more guidance. So that's I think one of the big, I'd say that's one of the bigger things that we learned about. But the great thing I think about seeing this as a process of learning while we're developing the archive itself, this means that I think we've been able to respond to that much more effectively in this fall.
Abby, do you want to speak on behalf of the editors about what we may have done differently, or how we might ask different framing questions even at this point?
You know, I've been trying to think about that as I'm listening to the answers of the panelists, and I think all of them have kind of hit the nail on the head that we were approaching this as more of a moment than I think it was. I don't know that we consciously did that, but I think we were kind of all so immersed in spring 2020 that we couldn't foresee what might follow. So I mean, I love that framing, Jason, of like putting COVID in the context of what does it mean for Black Lives Matter? What does it mean for the election? You know, what does it mean for the transition of power? What does it mean for all of these kind of bigger questions that we're grappling with as a society that are so deeply impacted by the pandemic, and that the pandemic is so deeply impacted by, right? You know, questions about the spread of COVID and things going on in the White House or in campaign events or at protests, you know, questions of whether COVID was spreading at protests. So I really like Jason's framing of specifying a moment in time. I don't think we could have been there when we were doing this work in April. And I really hope that we are able to continue to think about these things, if not in the pages of the journal, then in the blog.
And I'll just put a follow up with that. We are trying on our blog, which is at oralhistoryreview.org, to continue discussions. We've had a number of other guest posts, not just from these authors, about whether they're projects that are ongoing in the field. Some of them have been very technical related about how to do remote interviews and sort of the implications, what changes when you're interviewing remotely, and those sorts of things. And if you are involved in an oral history COVID related project or have things to say about that, please feel free to direct message me through whatever our Attendify, or however you want to find me. I've also been tweeting here during the session. We'd love to hear from you, and we want, just as we wanted to represent a lot of different voices and perspectives in this special section, we also really want to have those represented on our blog as well. And to that end, I'm going to try to follow up on some of these, some of the questions that are starting to come in through the chat as well. And please solicit those, or keep adding your questions to the chat, and I'll be making sure to pull those into the conversation here. First of all, there's the question, and in many ways this is really directed to Jason in some ways. How did you grapple with the decision to pursue a project in the first place, and the ethical implications of soliciting stories, experiences from individuals whose lives are being upended? And this was something I think every contributor to the special section touched on, this issue of ethics, of, is now the right time? Or should we wait? And wait for what? As Anna said, it seemed like a very temporary pause at first, but now that we know it's not, like, what would you be waiting for? We didn't know back in April what we would be waiting for, if the end was right around the corner, a better time to be able to have appropriate perspective on this. I think along those same lines, and there was just a question here as well about making sure any oral history project had a diverse range of perspectives. Unlike some of the events that Stephen was referring to earlier, of times of crisis, this pandemic is affecting everyone to various degrees, but no one is unaffected. I mean, obviously, frontline workers, people who are mourning the loss of loved ones, people who've been sick, are dealing with a different, or have lost their jobs, are dealing with one kind of trauma. But we all universally are affected to some degree or another. So how do you choose who to interview when everyone is a potential subject? Any of you can jump in on some of these issues. And if others in our audience have also started projects, we welcome your perspectives as well on how do you deal with the ethics of this? Who do you interview when we are all potential subjects?
I can maybe respond to the question of when or should we do interviews, or at least how we dealt with that on our end. So, of course, we worked from that simple premise of doing no harm as the first operating principle. So the question, the key was to listen to the potential narrators and see where they are. We were not choosing. We were not approaching individuals randomly. We already, as an institute, are deeply engaged and connected with the community where we live. And so we already had folks that we could reach out to and ask because there's trust and personal connections. The students were also reaching out to people within their own networks. So there was already that kind of trust network established. So that's how we decided who to interview and how to move forward. But in the most broad kind of philosophical sense, the question of should we do oral history interviews at that particular moment, and my response was yes, absolutely we should. We're historians, it's our responsibility to record history in moments of crisis, at moments in which the future is something we can't predict or foresee. Those are absolutely essential moments to to record in all different ways. And so that was kind of the operating principle for our project moving forward.
Yannick, can I jump in on this one? This answers the question you're asking and also goes back to the question you just asked previously. So we know this is a global pandemic and we know this is a national pandemic. And I think that was the national was the framing we had when we developed this section. But I think what we have learned since then is this is a highly particularized pandemic depending on where you live as well. And the experience varies so much by who you are, by demographically who you are, and by where you live. You know, of the four of us on the panel, plus Yannick, we have two folks from Philadelphia, one in DC, one in Texas, and one in Indiana. Jason, you're in Indiana, is that right?
Yes, Indianapolis, yeah.
Indianapolis. And so we have all experienced the pandemic quite differently. I applied in April for an internal grant from my university to do a COVID project in the classroom starting in the fall, kind of based on work I had done around Hurricane Sandy. By the time I got to July and found out I got the grant, I wasn't comfortable doing the work because I teach at a school that's right outside of New York City. Majority minority students who are quite economically vulnerable and who had experienced just profound loss in their communities and among their families. And so I wasn't comfortable doing that work. Now we're in October, things are a little bit more stable in those places. And we're talking about doing some of that work in much more contained ways in the classroom in the spring. So I think that part of your question kind of gets at this, like, when are we talking about doing the work and to whom are we doing it? And Carmen raised the same question in the chat, you know, how do we justify or how do we deal with the idea of reaching out to communities that have been so disproportionately impacted by COVID? I think that's something we need to reckon with as well.
This is something that I grappled with a lot while writing my piece. And part of it was how do I answer the questions from grantees who are asking, what do I do when my narrator, someone who I thought was going to be a narrator, now suddenly doesn't want to be part of my project or can't be part of my project? Or, you know, how do I approach my narrators when they are all Uber drivers and they now have no income and, you know, I'm asking them for this time and their resources when they don't have any income coming in, they don't have their own resources to survive. And so it was something that I definitely struggled with. But at the same time, there were a lot of people who were sort of reaching out and saying that, yes, I do want to participate, but it may not look the way that we originally thought the oral history was going to look. So maybe it's, you know, 20, 25 minutes here, 25 minutes there. Or, you know, maybe this is the opportunity for the narrator to have their say, to make a statement, to put something on record. Also, I think there are some projects that are doing, and I think, Jason, your project is doing this as well, of collecting materials to complement the interviews. So people can participate in various ways of submitting photographs or, you know, writing a letter or a journal, not just doing an oral history interview. And so I think those are really interesting ways to sort of open up oral history projects and maybe make them more accessible. Also thinking about sort of that ask of, you know, can you be a narrator for this project? Can you be a narrator for this project now? If not, you know, can I keep asking you later? You know, maybe your position changes, maybe your ability to do this interview changes later on and you want to contribute, or you know that you want to contribute now, you just can't do it this month or next month. And so maybe later. But another question for me was also, is it ethical for me as an oral historian to do particular interviews right now? am I in a place where I can really do my best work as an interviewer for these narrators? And if I can, that's great. But if I can't, then what am I doing in this oral history? How am I impacting or having an impact on the story that the narrator is telling, or what gets captured? If I myself am struggling to sit here and to deeply listen and empathize. And so it's not just asking the narrator, but it's also, what is my role in this, and how do I act ethically and responsibly as an interviewer, and what might be the supports in order for me as an interviewer to say, I can't do this interview right now. And what does that part of the oral history look like? Not just what are we asking of the narrator, but what are we promising and delivering as interviewers?
Yeah, I think this is all, Jason, and I think these are all really important points to consider. I think what I would encourage is to stay away from is a blanket response, either yes, we're all in, or no, it's too soon. I think we can be more thoughtful in that, and considering, as Anna mentioned, the interviewer context in which the interview is being conducted and the interviewee context within which the interview is being conducted. I think someone mentioned, this source material long term, just as a historian thinking about how valuable this source material is going to be at some point. We've got to balance that with the concern for the individual that's sitting in front of us, and just, is this too soon? Are they not in a position to participate in something like this? But I've long since passed on the idea that the passage of time makes things easier to talk about. And so I don't think we need to make some assumptions there as well. And so I think informed consent needs to take on a much more robust sort of process in a time like this when you're working mid-crisis. But I don't think it means that it's not possible.
We have a lot of comments and questions that are coming in through the chat. One from Linda Shopes about considering more longitudinal interviews, following up with narrators in a year or two. I know, Jason, in your article, you mentioned that. Definitely Jen Kramer in her article, Do No Harm, mentioned that as a really important part of the process. And as Anna just mentioned, like, just because you don't want to now shouldn't rule out a future interview, and just because you did now doesn't mean that you're committing to all the interviews in the future as well. Certainly that's a great strategy, and I think one that sort of speaks to this idea of, do we have the perspective now to really be doing this? But perhaps if we can continue to follow up with narrators, you definitely jump in if you want to speak to that comment at all. Another question is about sort of the choice of who to interview, especially how to reach out to communities that are particularly vulnerable during the pandemic, whether they're people of color or people who may not have that the emotional bandwidth because of being in the midst of trauma. Is it fair to ask potential narrators to contribute when they might be more focused on survival? But if we don't try to expand that sort of diverse network, we risk only interviewing people who are just safely working from home, who are not necessarily at risk in the same way or dealing with the same sorts of issues.
One of the things that I kept returning to was that I always tell my students that it's our job as the interviewer or the oral historian to ask the questions, and then the narrator decides whether or not or how they want to answer. I feel like it's a similar thing in asking people if they want to be part of an oral history project. I think that we definitely need to spend a lot of thought and care about how we approach people, how we ask them, how we shape our oral history projects. But a lot of these questions about, is it ethical to ask people to do oral histories right now? If you turn that around, is it ethical to not ask them to do oral histories right now? Returning to Mike Frisch's shared authority of, we oral historians are not the only ones making a decision right now. And if we don't ask narrators whether or not they want to be part of an oral history project, we are not recognizing and upholding their authority in being narrators, of deciding whether or not they want to be part of an oral history project, whether or not they want to do oral histories right now. So that's something that I kept thinking about, of not just sort of making that decision for them and saying, no, I can't ask them right now, but trying to have those conversations, opening up those conversations, asking the question and seeing what they think, rather than sort of assuming from my perspective what I think their answer will be.
We have a question here about from Mary Kay about wondering what a COVID-19 oral history project looks like 30 years from now. So we've been even talking about, whether to interview in April compared to October, and thinking about following up in a couple years. But as we all know, the kinds of oral history projects that we're all familiar with, I had the privilege of working with a collection of people who were interviewed who happened to talk about the 1918 pandemic extensively. These were interviews conducted in the early 1980s with people who were elderly, who had been children, young adults during that earlier pandemic. So how will those interviews be different? There's also a comment about how our memories fade over time. It will be a much different sort of oral history when we have that sort of long-term view looking back. Any thoughts from the panelists, or if anyone else wants to jump in? This is a fairly rhetorical question, and I know that none of us, even the best historians, cannot predict the future.
Stephen, you look like you wanted to go.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen. And I one of our participants, Ida Milne, can follow up after Stephen.
I think Jason's going. So Jason, I want to go back and tell Stephen to buy Zoom stock. You wanted to go back and give a project tip or something like that? You can do better than that.
Yeah, my immediate, that's such an interesting, these are all such wonderful and thoughtful questions, and I appreciate them. That's a great question. Being 7 months out now, you can already see historical memory being shaped and reshaped. I mean, we've seen it in our own work over the last several months. We've seen it play out at a high level in the media, in the way politicians speak about this thing. I remember very early on, the language was something to the effect of COVID-19 is all about contact tracing, keeping people socially distanced from each other, with the hope that someday there will be somewhere down in the future, there will be some kind of cure of some sort. And that rapidly transformed over the summer to, well, if you're just 6 feet from each other with a mask on, it's probably okay. And those are two very different stories that were coming from very high levels. And they've transformed the discourse on the ground. So of course, I can't imagine what this memory is going to be like 30 years from now. I can't even imagine what this memory is going to be like on November, let's just say 15th, and how that is going to be narrated. So yeah, I don't think there is necessarily a right for collecting facts, maybe. I don't imagine there's a correct time to do that. But rather, I think, I mean, as all oral history is doing, it's collecting narratives that are transforming and reproducing themselves and changing over time, which is why it's so important that longitudinal work is built into longer term oral history projects. We've decided that ours is going to be about 10 years. That's kind of how we're conceptualizing the work that we are doing. I imagine this is not going to be a problem for the first 2 or 3 years of this pandemic, but that long tail that Stephen spoke of earlier, the long COVID-19, it's going to be much harder to be able to fund this, I imagine, because we're funding our graduate students and our undergraduates doing this work. It's going to be a little harder 5-8 years down the road from here.
Can I just jump in real quick? Whoops. I asked that question because I think that one of the phenomena associated with what Stephen was talking about with regard to oral historians being more engaged in contemporary events is I think that really raises some interesting questions about how people who are sitting in these chairs 30 years from now in faculty positions or teaching graduate students or whatever, I think it's going to be really important for them to go back and conduct projects that, you know, maybe they can't re-interview the same people, but to get that more distanced perspective. And I think that is going to be something that will be really informative for our future colleagues.
Yeah,
I want to make
agree.
sure. Go ahead, Stephen. Follow up.
Okay. All right. This is the fun of Zoom calls. I would just say, and I think that's something different we're dealing with here. That's, again, and I've said it, but mid-crisis, it's messy. This is a really messy time. I mean, we're generally pulled, and our interviewees are pulled also to draw lessons learned. I mean, even when they're telling us an experience, they have a narrative. Often they have a narrative in mind that has those elements of an arc to their story. There's no arc here. I mean, they've got loose pieces that they're trying to pull together for us. And so there is definitely a messiness there, but I think it's, and if I can be objective, I think it's something quite interesting that's going on with these projects that's not normally there.
I want to make sure we turn to Ida, who wanted to jump in a moment ago.
Great, thanks for that. Well, I am a historian of the 1918 flu, and I've been collecting since 2006. And I was lucky enough to interview about 50 people who actually lived through it. And some of them caught it, and some of them lost family to it. And so when you talk about, I interviewed them when they were in their 90s, and the oldest was 106. So when you're talking about memory fading, for some of them, the memory did fade, but for others, the memory was like it happened yesterday. And Stephen, you mentioned about trauma. I mean, one woman actually got an acute attack of diarrhea when I accidentally revealed to her in the middle of an interview that 2 of her cousins, who were 2 and 3 years of age, had died in the pandemic. I knew it from a newspaper clipping. And she actually got really ill in the middle of the interview with the shock. And it was over 90 years later. But the other thing I'm collecting at the moment. So some people, the memories, sometimes particularly from diseases, our memories can be particularly acute, but the types of memory were quite different. I'd love to see a lot of memory being collected from children now, but I don't think that's going to really happen, because children remember in a very different way. They see things much more emotionally, I think, than we do. Whereas we tend, once I could see even the older children who are maybe 14, 15, remembered in a kind of a more journalistic memory. They saw wider events in the outside world, whereas the younger ones were doing things like watching their parents being so anxious or trying to hide things from them. They noted more emotions, a lot more. But the other project I've been involved since about, well, February really, with a group of medical professionals, politicians, and journalists, and then me as a historian of the 1918 flu, in what's a WhatsApp group. There's about 200 of us in it, and we were trying to share information and get good quality information out into the public very quickly. But I also turned my oral history hat on them and insisted that they leaned very heavily on them to document their own story as medical professionals, because they go through a particularly, I suppose, tense and very up close and very difficult relationship with this pandemic in the way that we as historians or oral historians don't. And that transition you were talking about, the emotions, Jason, you were talking about how quickly everything changes in this. It's extraordinary. You know, even in days, your whole position could change about it. So I have them not being interviewed directly, but some of them are contributing to the Royal College of Physicians and Oral History Memoir there, where we will interview them if they want us to. But we're also getting them to record into dictaphones or to write memoir as well on it. And one of the big absences for me as a historian of the 1918 flu was I have only one memoir from an Irish doctor from the 1918 flu. So I really want more for when I'm writing this book in about 30 years' time. I don't see myself doing a COVID book for another 10 years at least, because we haven't got perspective yet.
I see Heather Shelton shared the link to, there's a crowdsourced effort to gather information about the various oral COVID-19 collecting projects. And I think those are not just oral history, if am I correct, that those are public history in general. There are many, many, many efforts underway, and not just those from historians at institutions like Jason's. There are many at smaller historical societies, and journalists are doing many. We do have a really great article in the collection by Evan Falkenberry, who looks at what oral historians can learn from the journalists and vice versa. So many journalists, I'm sure you've seen them, the oral history of the pandemic and so forth. Is it possible that we are collecting too many interviews? What will we do with them all?
I mean, this is a great point, and it's one of the things that kind of, I've been asked this question a lot. What's the difference between oral history and journalism? And oral history has as one of its fundamental best practices the archival practice, which is really different from the work of journalists, which is much more generally in the moment and for a particular end, and they don't necessarily save the sources beyond the article that's produced. So it's hard for me to say that we're collecting too many stories. It's hard for me to ever say that. I think the question is, as you said, like, what is our capacity for archiving and storing and processing? And if we, as you know, Anna, you made this point early on, the resources available right now are so limited. What can we do with these interviews, and how can we make them usable in the future? Not that it's a bad thing to be collecting them, even if we're not going to do that. I think there's value in that. But as oral historians, I think that's one of our central aims. Doug is sitting right here, and he has created a platform in OHMS that may allow for some digitization and archiving and collection of these stories that would not have been available, 10 years ago. That's Doug Boyd for folks who are not aware.
Any other thoughts about the vast quantity? issue?
This makes me think of Linda Shope's article about archives and thinking about curating archives. So I don't think, as Abby said, I don't think there are too many, but I think it's important to think about, again, as we've talked about, whose experiences are being documented, who is agreeing to oral histories right now, who has the time and resources to do that, who is creating the project, who's writing the project design, and what perspectives or experiences are being left out. I think for me, that's the more important question than are we collecting too many?
Sort of a related question really is, what is our capacity as oral historians? I mean, Anna, you hit on this in your article about the precarity of particularly the independent oral historian. The budget realities are much different today than they were 6 months ago. Even then, it's not like every oral history center had millions of excess dollars to spend on creating projects. How do we keep it sustainable, whether it's COVID-related projects or, many of our institutions are facing dramatic budget cuts and we have to make choices. How do we stay in business in a sustainable way with the realities of the economic side of things that the pandemic has brought about as well? Sorry, Linda, I see your hand up. You want to jump in?
Yes, since Anna invoked me, I'll jump in here. I've been putting some comments in the chat. I don't want to impute anybody here, obviously, but I'll make a couple of points. First of all, I am aware, just through decades of experience in oral history, that there are enormous numbers of collections that are just gathering dust. There is a rush to collect frequently. Doing the interviews is the sexy part. It's the meaningful part. There's got to be a plan for dealing with them. Otherwise, I think we're really doing our practice a disservice. The other thing that concerns me about a rush to collect, and again, I'm not saying that any of you is doing that at all, that it's not done well. You may disagree with me quite legitimately, but I would rather have one good interview than 10 mediocre ones. I can argue the other side of that, but that would be my approach. And, I would just put out there the need for a careful, thoughtful approach, which, I have no reason to doubt you're not doing that.
I welcome any responses to Linda, as well as I sort of shifted my question in a different direction as well about the economic side of oral history. And we only have about 10 minutes left in the session, so if there are other directions you want to take this in as well, feel free to add it to the chat, or as Linda did, raise your hand, unmute yourself.
I think Linda's point is a good one. While somebody's thinking up a question, what I'm excited about is new tools that are coming available to analyze existing collections. And so I worry less about, are we doing too much in recent years, just because I feel like there's new ways we can look at and analyze collections now. And it seems to be continuing to evolve into some really exciting ways we can look at things that we've gathered.
I mean, I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody.
Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, okay. One of the things that I'm very interested about the scale of collecting that we're having is the possibility, to follow up with what Stephen just said, of drawing those things together. I'm actually an 18th century scholar by training, and so the idea of having too many archives is beyond me, but I know that's a thing. But the idea of having born digital objects, such as what we have now effectively in databases, that can then all be drawn from and connected to each other, is hugely exciting to me as an interloper in 21st century history by virtue of my role as director of our institute.
Hi, I'm Cassie. I just have a sort of experiential anecdote to add, in that the Jerome Robbins Dance Division recorded an AIDS oral history project, and it was highly curated and originally in the 1980s. And you know, there were like 10 original interviews. And it's recently experienced a, sorry, my cat is yelling in the background. It recently experienced a revival of interest in the community. I mean, it's 40, or sorry, not 40 years, but my math, 30 years later. So, I mean, sometimes these objects or these collections do gather dust, and then they experience a revival of interest when it's time for them to be reevaluated and looked at again from a different perspective. And yeah, I just wanted to add that point in. And in recent oral histories, I've been again approaching this idea of looking back on that time for a collection to have. And I know that scholars in looking at that collection wish there was more material. Like there's always, you know, a desire for, you know, more of those oral histories, but they aren't there. So.
There's a great comment about perhaps the value in text mining, some of the COVID-19 related interviews. I can really see that, you know, our vocabulary, we've developed all these terms that no one was using a year ago, for sure. I could see the value of seeing just how some of our language, the use of terms like flatten the curve and social distancing and all of these things, how they were introduced and probably appear at different times, and we're already have shifted some of that language just, you know, 7-8 months in now. I think there could be some really interesting ways, since we will have a mass of data available. Again, some of this obviously entails that we, I guess if many of us are interviewing over Zoom and these other platforms that generate rough transcripts for us instantaneously as well. So it's a very different field. That's something we haven't really hit on at all, just how oral history may change as a result of conducting it in the ways that we've had to conduct it in these last few months. The field did not really ever embrace interviewing from a distance. Remote interviews were not a standard procedure. How do the technologies that we're using change the way we will use oral history, the way we might just conduct interviews in the future?
I was really sort of inspired's the wrong word, but it's what's coming to mind, by Sarah Dzedzik's article about remote interviewing, and the point that she brings up that outside of the pandemic setting, these issues around health and face-to-face interviewing don't go away, that they've always been here. And so the idea of making it part of our practice to do virtual interviews where it may be better for the narrators and the interviewers' health or their situations, wherever they are, to do a remote interview. And that's something that I think the field has sort of acquiesced to in the past when it's, you know, the extreme circumstances when an in-person interview just cannot be done. But I think that this is a great opportunity for us to explore that more and figure out ways in which that will incorporating remote interviewing techniques into our toolkit will encourage more people to be interviewers and more people to be narrators who before felt that they were shut out because they could not participate in an in-person interview.
Yeah, in general, I thought one of the things I love about your article, Anna, is that you think about what the opportunities for the field are, how it may change in perhaps positive, you know, more inclusive ways that we never would have expected when we were facing crisis. We are just about out of time. If there are any additional comments or questions, definitely want to hear them. I'm really, so I definitely want to encourage you to read the articles that these panelists and the rest of the contributors to the special section wrote. Again, I'm so grateful to Routledge for making them freely available to everyone. And so share them widely since they are available. Way up at the top of the chat, I posted a link to the entire table of contents. Again, I'll put out my pitch. Please feel free to contact me here, or you can contact me through Attendify or Twitter, or wherever, however you can find me if you'd like to contribute to our blog. We also, of course, I'm sure we'll be publishing many, many more articles related to COVID-19 in the journal itself. So if you have ideas that you're working on, feel free to contact me or Abby. I think Dave Crusoe might be in this meeting as well. We're the 3 co-editors of the journal. We sadly don't have a table set up in Second Life where you can come find us and chat, but hopefully you can find us otherwise during these next couple days of the conference. We're really so grateful to the authors of the special section. We ask so much of you. We're also very grateful to our peer reviewers who turned around peer review in 10 days, 2 weeks. It was amazing. And they had such insightful comments that really helped our authors rethink and reshape some of the ideas that they were wrestling with. I can't believe that how many people just made this issue happen so rapidly. It's kind of unheard of. Being an editor of an academic journal, you see the glacial pace that publishing moves normally. And so I'm still astounded that we were able to pull this off. So many thanks to all of you who contributed to that.
Let us thank you all as well.
Our pleasure. We're glad we could see it shepherded along. So yeah, please do be in touch. And there's lots of great links in this chat. I don't know, are we getting the chats archived in any function? Oral History Association 9.
This chat has been awesome. This is like the best chat ever.
Yeah.
So we need to save it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If whoever is the official host of this Zoom room, please make sure that we get a copy of this whole chat. Be great. I can publish it on the blog.
Looks like we just got confirmation that it will be saved and recorded.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we hope to see you all around throughout the rest of the conference. And again, thank you so much for joining us and for all your amazing contributions to the discussion.